There are a few names as closely identified with the French intellectuals of the 1950s and 1960s as Albert Camus. Although he was once shunned by his contemporaries for betraying their left-wing ideals, his ideas are now lauded for having best stood the test of time. Journalist Olivier Todd has produced an extensive biography of Camus that was a bestseller in France. It is called Albert Camus, A Life, and I am pleased to have a friend of some 20-plus years, Olivier Todd, on this program for the first time. Welcome to this program. It's great to see you. Why did you want to do this? Who was Albert Camus, and why should we care?
Well, I think I started looking at Camus when I was 14 during the German occupation in Paris. I took the book with me, The Stranger, to the Luxembourg Gardens, and I got a shock. This was something original. It talked about justice. It talked about all sorts of things. And ever since, I've been interested in his works, and I follow them, liking some books, disliking others. I also happen to have known Sartre, and you know that they quarreled together.
Yes, yes.
And I like the period, artistically, philosophically, and I think it was a good time to do it because, as biographers know, when you're dealing with contemporary people who have just died, you can't actually interview witnesses. You have to have a period of mourning. Now, there are enough witnesses to get hold of them now, though they have died recently. On the other hand, I got a lot of original material.
I want to talk about some of the material you got and the people you talked to, because enough time has passed since his death. He died, what, age 46?
Yes, in 1960.
Right after he'd won the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
Yeah. Enough time has passed so that people are prepared to talk. Other people who are close to them die, and therefore people are not embarrassed to come forward and talk about relationships that they might have.
And even private relationships.
And private relationships.
When his second wife was alive, it would have been both immoral and slightly indecent to talk about his, how shall we say, tempestuous love life.
Yes. Women are central to his life in terms of his passions.
Right.
You know. Is there in France today the kind of intellectual debate that was there when Jean-Paul Sartre, who you knew better, I suspect?
Yes, yes. No, there isn't. No, there isn't. You know, the central question in the 40s and 50s, especially, was communism and Marxism. And why Camus is important there, apart from being a great fiction writer, is that he alone took on the Marxist establishment in 1951, 1952. And he said very simple things like, you know, ends don't justify means. The revolution, whether it's the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution or the 1789 French Revolution, was not only an entirely positive. This is the kind of thing that other historians later on, the so-called new historians like Furet, said. But in 1952, this was news in France, where 30% of the people voted communist, and there were still a lot of illusions fostered by people like Sartre about what went on behind the bamboo and the Iron Curtain.
What was it about him that gave him, what indications from his life, the fact that he was an outsider, the fact that he came from Algiers, that made him so steadfast in his moral authority and authenticity, and is prepared to take on people like Jean-Paul Sartre?
Well, because he was a man of integrity, and also he was not an intellectual befogged by ideas. The strange thing about intellectuals, you know, compared to farmers, peasants, and workers, is that once they get hold of an ideology, they enclose themselves into it, and they try to tell you that it's midnight, even if it's midday. Now, Camus would not buy this. You know, Sartre was a genius. I think there's no doubt about it, how evil and misled he may have been. Camus was a very great talent. He is a man who tried to keep informed about what went on beyond the Iron Curtain. He interviewed witnesses, he read, and finally he decided on his own he would take on what seemed to be the left-wing, non-communist establishment.
I mean, that's understandable to me from this distance and from this time. What I don't understand is why Jean-Paul Sartre held on to those ideas of Stalinism and the left when it was so apparent.
Well, Sartre was an extraordinarily brilliant and very complicated mind. He tried to send side by side what General de Gaulle called the hegemonies, that is to say the Russian camp and the so-called American camp. Yeah. And he said that you had to choose, and Camus, for a very long time, refused to do this. On the other hand, you know, Sartre had a kind of philosophical training which allows you to say almost anything. Camus was not as good a philosopher as Sartre in the old tradition.
Wasn't trained as a philosopher.
But,
wasn't trained as a philosopher.
Well, he was trained, but he wasn't a pure philosopher. That doesn't mean that he wasn't an important political thinker. You know, in this book that created such a row with Sartre, the rebel, Camus says some extremely simple things about what people should do, what they should do when they're facing problems like commitment. And he says that not anything goes. Sartre, you know, I'm sorry to say so because I rather liked him, was, I'm weighing my words, a kind of bloodthirsty intellectual. You know, he admired people like Castro and Che Guevara, not Camus. Camus was a very moral personality. Just to give you one example, after the liberation of Paris, there was a big problem with the writers who had collaborated. Now, at first, Camus said they should be punished, they should be executed. And very quickly, he switched sides and he said no. You know, he was against the death penalty and he wrote a book about it. Sartre went on and on and on, asking for them to be executed. Now, why? I have a suspicion that one of the reasons is that Sartre was not really a member of the resistance, whereas Camus was, and he had to make up for it. And this is something that intellectuals often do.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, is any evidence for that other than the vehemence of his protest? It's almost like you say, you protest too much, Mr. Sartre.
Right. Well, we know that Sartre didn't do very much during the resistance, and we know that Camus was
very involved.
I mean, he wasn't a hero, he wasn't a leader like Jean Moulin, but you know, there are some indicators. For instance, if you were an active member of the resistance, you had false identity papers, and that's what Camus had. Sartre didn't. But at this stage, you know, I think that one should try and go beyond their quarrels. Some people say, I'm a Sartrean, therefore I cannot appreciate Camus' work. Well, I'm not of that persuasion. Today I find it quite easy to say that I like The Fall, my favorite Camus book, that I also enjoy Words by Sartre. And I think those quarrels have to be set right historically, but that we should go beyond them.
Yeah. Those French intellectuals were in love with words.
They got drunk on words. I mean, no, there's no doubt about it. You know, the rationalist tradition allows you to get away with anything. And I'm very surprised, for instance, to see that people like Derrida in America seem to be the craze. To me, it's totally unimportant and meaningless. That being said, I have to admit that I read philosophy in Cambridge, and that sort of nonsense is not popular.
Yeah. There is a little bit of an evolution of your own life. I mean, you went into, in Vietnam, you were there early, in a sense, and you came to report from Vietnam, and then came later to say, this is not a question of black and white. These people are more than nationalism at play here. There's totalitarianism at play here.
Oh, yes. I started covering Vietnam in 1965 and only came to certain conclusions in 1973. I'd been north and south. Then I walked into a Viet Cong zone with a colleague of mine, Ron Moreau from Newsweek, and we were unannounced, so there were no Potemkin villages. And I realized very quickly he spoke fluent Vietnamese. I'd been to North Vietnam, that there was not going to be a national reconciliation. And I came out of it and said, comrades, we've been wrong. These people are red fascists. And I got into a bit of trouble over that in those days, but now it's a series of platitudes and cliches.
What did Camus feel about America? He clearly didn't share the anti-Americanism of...
No. Actually, Camus was very careful. You know, most Frenchmen who come to America, if they stay 2 weeks or 2 months, feel that they have to be a Tocqueville, and they lay down the law about what, you know, this is what Americans are like. Camus is extraordinarily careful. And this was confirmed to me by one of his friends or girlfriends, Patricia Blake. He was very, very, very diffident about passing judgment, and he refused to write about America when he went back. But in his letters, he's pretty warm-hearted. He also has his very curious aspects. For instance, Patricia told me that she couldn't understand why he loved, what is it, the Bowery's Follies in down south.
Yeah, Bowery. Yeah.
And he was very, very careful. And finally, I mean, politically, he admitted that, you know, they were, notwithstanding the difficulties and the crimes and the horrors of what people in Europe called American imperialism, quote, quote, at least this was an open society, whereas on the other side, it was a very closed society.
A little bit more about Camus, and then I want to talk a few minutes about France today. Algeria. He came from Algeria. He came up from a poor background.
Yes, that's very important, because he's a poor white, and he knows what it is like to be poor as a white or as an Arab in North Africa. Yeah. And then in the 30s, he's a member of the Communist Party in Algeria, and he leaves the Communist Party because the Algerian Communist Party, then, like the French Communist Party, towed the line, the Moscow line, and the Moscow line was the soft-pedal anti-colonial propaganda. People have forgotten that completely. And he resigns from the party, and they call him a Trotskyite. I found a document in Moscow which calls him a Trotskyite. Then in 1945, there's a revolt in Algeria, and the only man, it coincides with the end of the war for us, so people don't talk about it. But the French army massacres thousands of people there. Camus is the only one who writes an article saying Algeria is not France, which is interesting because later on the die-hard slogan will be Algeria is France. Yes. Then comes the 1954 uprising, and Camus, right to his death in 1960, is totally torn. He will not accept the idea of Algerian independence. That is absolutely certain, for many reasons. And the first one is that he thought that the poor whites there, 1 million of them, were also entitled to be Algerians. I also think that he was very suspicious of the main party, the National Liberation Front. He felt it was very authoritarian. That being said...
Bidbel and Boumediene and all those.
Two things. I think one should admit that he wasn't in touch with what was going on in the countryside. He didn't speak Arabic. He denounced terrorism and counter-terrorism. He constantly thought of his mother being blown up in a tram. But if you see his whole evolution over Algeria, I think it is totally unfair to say, like Professor Edward Said.
Edward Said from Columbia.
Yeah, he keeps on saying, it seems that, I quote him, that Camus has an uninformed colonial sensibility. It's far more complex than that, far more complicated. Camus was a divided man till the very end, optimistic and pessimistic. And in his last book, The First Man, you can see this evolution. At one point there's a settler who talks with Jacques Cormery, the main character, who is Camus. Jacques Cormery has 4 women in his life, and so has Camus.
When he died.
Yeah, and the old settler, talking about the relationship between whites and Arabs or Kabyles in Africa, says, I quote him, you know, one day we cut each other's balls, and the next day we get reconciled. And Camus was longing for reconciliation. And in fact, I think that what he wanted for Algeria was what most of us want for South Africa, you know, multiracial, multi-ethnic country.
His last book, published posthumously, was dedicated to his mother,
yes,
who was illiterate.
Yes, and the dedication is very moving. It says, to you who will never be able to read this. His mother is very important in his life. You must realize that not only was she very poor, not only was she illiterate, but she had a speech defect. And Camus could talk to her throughout his life, but never with her. Now, I leave it to analysts and psychiatrists to speculate on how the most important woman in his life, as in ours perhaps, his mother, influenced his relationship with other women, which was rather complicated.
You feel convinced that it did, as it does in many
I think so, men. Yes. I think that up to a point it did, as well as his 2 disastrous marriages, of course.
He also had tuberculosis.
Yes, very important. I mean, I must say that's one of the discoveries I made. I knew he'd been slightly ill, but at 17, this chap in North Africa, no antibiotics, very poor milieu, discovers that he's very mortal. Because in those days, I think 1 out of 3 or 4 cases, patients died. And I think most young people, my sons at any rate, think they're immortal when they're on bicycles. No, he didn't. He read Epictetus. And throughout his life, he was sick. Throughout his life, he spat blood. During the liberation of Paris, for instance, he's crossing Paris, and suddenly he feels unwell, has to go and see a doctor. And that went on to the end of his life.
Central to his view of the world is his moral...
Integrity.
Integrity.
Yes, I think so. His moral and artistic integrity. I think if you look at the way he works, he started something and he finished it. And he kept on at it. And also, he had a kind of huge project. This man, when he was 20, decided that he would write a series of works in 3 cycles. cycles of the absurd, one novel, The Stranger, one essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, and then one play, Caligula, and he did that, switching to the revolt, and at the end he was going to do the same thing, and his last novel, posthumously published, The First Man, was going to be the centerpiece of another cycle.
Speaking of cycles, where is France in its political life now that you have Chirac as president and Jospin a socialist, having won the recent election?
Well, we're in a very curious situation, really. I mean, this is not an orthodox view. I don't think the French Constitution bequeathed to us by de Gaulle is a very good thing, because it creates a bicephalic system. And what is called cohabitation means that the president can be of one color and the prime minister another. So it's always very difficult to know who is responsible for what, and they bicker. And I suspect that the French are happy with the situation because it allows them to enjoy a certain kind of status quo, where neither to the left nor are we to the right. And at the top, the gentlemen seem to be going on, and after all, France is a civilized country, we're not going to have a revolution, and we'll muddle through.
Albert Camus, A Life. Olivier Todd, the author. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.